Okay, so um, what I was hoping to talk about today is thinking about energy, specifically sustainable energy, so renewable energy and energy efficiency, at a scale that is typically not really considered in planning circles or in policy-making circles, right? So renewable energy, energy efficiency are often kind of considered as individual projects, individual locations where you might install some solar or maybe a building that you make more energy efficient. Um, the research, some of the research I lead with the foundation tries to think about these questions at a larger scale, what we call infrastructure scale. So one way to think about infrastructure scale is to consider things in your day-to-day life that are infrastructure versus things that are one-off individual projects, right? So you can think of when you purchase a house, for instance, there are certain elements inside of that house that are part of the infrastructure of the house. You don't have to separately purchase, say, a kitchen. Typically, a kitchen is included in the house. So that's kind of like an infrastructure component of the house. So when I say infrastructure scale sustainable energy, you can kind of think of embedding the sustainable energy solutions into the infrastructure of, in this case, a city or multiple cities, right? So where a city in and of itself becomes um, sustainable over time through a pursuit of sustainable energy. And what I thought I would do today, especially, is focus on city examples in the Korean context, right? So I've done some research projects, several research projects on Korean cities. And the examples that we've kind of evaluated show some interesting insights that hopefully are of use to you in your studies and in your fields of interest. Um, so yeah, so as mentioned, I work for the Foundation for Renewable Energy and Environment, or FREE. Here are some of the folks that work with me. Um, so the organization is led by Dr. John Byrne, who will be speaking in this lecture series next week. And his presentation kind of follows or starts where my presentation concludes. So some of the questions that were asked, I will defer to Dr. Byrne, right? So some of the questions are quite relevant for his presentation, and I don't necessarily want to take away from his presentation by addressing those questions. So then there's myself. I'm the research director at the foundation. So as kind of mentioned in the introduction, I oversee some of the research projects. I try to hopefully meet all the deadlines and get the projects done on time. Then there's Dr. Jung Sok Seo, who some of you might know. He's quite active in the Korean context. He is the director for our East Asia office in Seoul. And then there's some research team members. I list one of them here, but we have several additional ones as well. Um, so what I would do for today's lecture is kind of first illustrate some of the challenges when you're trying to think of energy at the infrastructure scale, starting from kind of like the international perspective to the national and then to the local perspective. Obviously, to do that, I'm kind of skipping over some of those contexts. I'm not diving into the international perspective in great detail, but I'm kind of illustrating some of the challenges that especially the South Korean peninsula faces when discussing energy. Um, so then the kind of like the main component of the lecture is to consider how you can think about energy at the infrastructure scale and how you can do research at that level and what kind of questions you might be able to answer when um, considering energy at that level. And then I have a short section at the end, kind of illustrating um, that it's not just theoretical, it's not just research. Cities are actually pursuing some of these ideas, are actually trying to implement some of these ideas, some with more success than others. And then I'm leaving quite a significant amount of time for questions and answers, hopefully answers, at least questions. So that is pretty much the format, but please feel free during the presentation if you have a pressing question that you need an answer for. I'm totally okay with you like raising your hand in the Zoom system, and I'll try to address your question at that time. If it's not a super pressing question, then obviously it's also totally fine to do it at the end of the lecture. Right. So when you're thinking about energy transitions, there's a series of challenges that kind of make the decisions difficult, that complicate the decision-making process. And as I mentioned, I was thinking of kind of going from the international to the local perspective. So when you start at the international perspective for South Korea, one way to kind of think about energy is to think about the balance between imports and exports for energy. Many of you likely know this, South Korea is critically dependent on energy imports to power its day-to-day life. Its transportation system is critically dependent on oil imports, but also its electric power infrastructure is critically dependent on importing a variety of energy resources. The scale of the dependence is quite striking. Let's see. Why is it not? There we go. So when you just put the balance between energy imports and exports, this should say energy, not electricity, but energy imports and exports in petajoules, you kind of see that the balance overwhelmingly is focused on imports, right? So the amount of energy being imported is dramatically larger than the amount of energy products being exported, to the tune of roughly six to seven times more imports than exports. So when you kind of say how dependent is Korea on imports versus exports, you see that it's a roughly 82%, as high in the past as 88% import dependency ratio between the balance between these two aspects. Right. So in 2023, it was about 82%. The trend appears to be one where the imports are becoming more and more relevant rather than less relevant. So the self-sufficiency ratio of the country, the country's ability to produce energy products for its own use is decreasing, and the dependence on imports for energy is increasing over time. Right, so that's obviously a challenge when you're thinking about the energy transition, when you're thinking about moving from a traditional energy architecture to one that is more dependent on renewable energy and energy efficiency. Especially renewable energy is typically a local product, something that you implement within, say, in the context of this conversation, within a city, but more typically done outside of cities, and then the energy is imported into the urban environment. But at least it's within the national context, right? Or it's at least within the country itself, within the local/regional context. So if your import dependency ratio and your energy imports are high, that is kind of a challenging perspective to pursue. If you're pursuing a self-sufficiency ratio that is high, this complicates that decision-making process. One way to kind of illustrate South Korea's unique position in this matter is to look at a global import ranking. So in absolute units of imports, so the scale of imports, South Korea ranks fifth in the world as to how much energy products it's importing, which is quite staggering considering that there are some countries obviously above South Korea in terms of this list that are significantly larger, but there's also quite a few countries that are significantly larger and still below South Korea. So South Korea is quite in a unique position where it's quite dependent on importing energy products like I said, for its transportation system and its electric power system. So moving from kind of like the international perspective to the national perspective, the energy transition, while there are policy targets to increase the reliance on renewable energy substantially, right? So there's targets to raise it to the say 20 or 30% of renewable energy self-sufficiency rate within the country. The current perspective is still quite heavily dominated by traditional energy sources. So here you see the perspective of electricity generation. So this is purely just for the electric power sector. Over 2000 to 2023, and you see that the reliance on a quite dirty energy source like coal still dominates the electric power sector, and it has been decreasing in recent years, but if you take the longer perspective over the last 2 decades or so, the dependence on this energy source has been increasing over time. Similarly, the nuclear energy sector in Korea is quite large. It's the second largest source of electricity generation in the country, and it's increasing over time as well. And then finally, natural gas is rapidly increasing over the same time frame as a electricity source for the electric power sector. So these three sources together still are dominant in the electric power sector. They vastly vastly outpace the other sources for electricity generation. So that kind of perspective obviously also complicates an energy transition pursuit. And I'll get back to what that kind of means when you're thinking about energy transitions at the local scale. So when you look at the remaining sources, the fourth largest electricity generation source is actually now solar PV, which is quite an achievement, right? It's quite something for a relatively new electricity source to be increasing as fast as it is. You can see that the rate of change is quite significant since about 2010 to now. It has kind of entered the electric power stage, if you will, and it is continuing to grow quickly. However, it's obviously still a minor contributor to the overall system in absolute unit terms. There are ways to think about it where solar is producing electricity at certain times of the day and potentially at the right moments of demand. So it's not necessarily a limited contribution, but it is in absolute units, it's still quite small. The other sources of renewable energy combined are also growing, not as fast as solar PV, but they are still also increasing as well over time. So together, they are becoming quite a substantial proportion of the electric power system in Korea. And then finally, oil for electricity generation has been on the decline for about 2 decades and looks like it won't be used for electricity generation in any large numbers moving forward. So this is one way to kind of look at the national electric power sector. So we did the international perspective. This is kind of the national perspective, and obviously there's much more to it than this, but this gives you some framework to think about the questions that we'll be discussing today. So when you then look at cities themselves, which is kind of the main focus of this lecture and is the main focus of a lot of the research that we do at my organization, where we look at cities and we look at the solutions and opportunities that cities have available to them. A important realization when you look at a city as a unit of energy consumption, right? So a city uses energy for its day-to-day operations. So people need to move around and people need to eat and people need to heat and cool their structures. A predominant realization is that the vast majority of cities on the planet around the world rely on imports for those services, right? So not just Korean cities. I list here Korean cities, but most cities are heavily dependent on importing their energy sources to power their daily life. And they are dependent on this network of energy infrastructure that can, in some cases, be old, can be fragile, can be unreliable, can have certain difficulties with its operations, say, right? So there's a risk component associated with relying on outside of the city energy sources, and that risk comes in the way of supply risk, where the city might be in competition for supply with other cities, for instance, or might be in competition for supply with other actors in the country. And it comes in kind of more of a systemic energy injustice risk, which I'll talk about in the next slide as well. But when you review the Korean layout, right? So here you see a map of the South Korean peninsula. You see the energy infrastructure listed here, where the transmission lines for electricity are connected to the sources of electricity generation, which are predominantly on the coastlines of the country. And you see, for instance, my main case study of Daejeon. For today, I'll focus mostly on Daejeon, a little bit on Seoul. But you see that Daejeon relies on electricity imports to the city to power its daily life, right? So there's the traditional energy infrastructure, which is, like I said, mostly located around the coastlines, where you see nuclear power facilities and thermal power facilities, and they are transmitted. The electricity is transmitted into the city centers. So the energy metabolism, if you will. So if you would say like a city has a metabolism similar as a human metabolism, but now for energy, you can kind of see that this metabolism relies on an intake of ex-urban sources. And in that process, some of the risks associated with the energy system are supply risk is attributed to the city itself, but some of the other risks are pushed out of the city, right? So some of the other risks are borne by the communities that are next to, for instance, the thermal power plant, right? So the local air pollution risk for population health and air quality, that's pushed out of the city and to communities where the power is actually produced, whereas the power goes, the significant amount of the electricity generation goes to the city itself. So there's an imbalance in the risk there. One way to consider that imbalance is evaluating, for instance, the benefit that that people inside of cities can experience by being far away from harmful infrastructure or potentially harmful infrastructure. So this is research done by a colleague of mine, Joo-Hee Lee, together with John Byrne, Dr. Byrne, where if you evaluate the average housing price at the county level and you place that in perspective against the evacuation zone around nuclear power plants, you see an interesting relationship that is evident, where the highly valuable housing is not located close to nuclear power facilities. And this is perhaps an obvious research result in some ways, right? So you would more or less expect that people don't tend to want to live close to large energy generation facilities, either nuclear or otherwise, right? So a large coal power generation facility also is not the most pleasant facility to live next to. But this kind of brings home a message that there's a risk component to this balance. So there's a benefit in terms of where the economic benefits are located, and further away from nuclear power plants, there are higher value housing communities. But there's also a risk component that is distributed to those who are closer to, in this case, the nuclear power facilities, where there's an evacuation zone in the case of an accident. So let's say a Fukushima repeat, those that live close will be forced to evacuate because they are at risk of the consequences of such an event. And that is a risk that is displaced from those in the wealthier communities that benefit from the electricity that was generated at that facility. So when you're, as a city, considering a transition strategy, one factor to consider when you want to talk about energy at the infrastructure scale is where do we place the risk of the new energy infrastructure that we're pursuing, and is that risk being displaced to those that don't benefit from the infrastructure itself or benefit less from the infrastructure, right? So here in this chart, you can see that some of the very high housing prices are far away from nuclear power plants. They tend to be largely in Seoul because Seoul has some very high value housing. So a city like Seoul, when it contemplates changing its energy direction, could be faced with a decision of maintaining this type of imbalance or pursuing a different strategy where the imbalance is targeted and hopefully resolved with the deployment of a new strategy. So the final perspective is to look at inside of cities, right? So we went from like the international to the national to the interregional challenges, and one final challenge I just kind of want to cover is the inside of the city perspective. So here's the city of Daejeon. We've kind of identified quote unquote communities inside of the city by just separating the city in equal size blocks. And what you see is that the higher density center of the city is the city center that consumes most of the electricity, right? Which makes sense. That's most of the commercial activity, most of the people are in that area. But there's an imbalance there between the consumption in the city center region or in the external regions of the city. So that's one final perspective on the energy transition question, that the in-urban or the inside of the city energy profile also has a risk and responsibility balance between energy consumption and the consequences of such energy consumption, like pollution, like local air quality degradation. So there's another balance there as well. So that is something to consider, and we'll come back to this chart at the end, which was also in the reading assigned prior for this lecture. So one final perspective is to then look at the consequences of the electric power system. So when you just look at cities, you can actually see that quite a substantial proportion of emissions, in this case, it's greenhouse gas emissions, so carbon dioxide emissions, quite a significant proportion of those are due to the activities that take place inside of cities, right? So cities have not just a responsibility towards its own population, not just towards the relationship between the city and its villages and towns around it, but there's also a global responsibility for a city to become more sustainable over time. So what you see here is that the 5 largest cities in terms of emissions in China roughly contribute about 8% of their national emissions, which is substantial for 5 cities. China is obviously a very large country and a very large emitter of carbon dioxide. So 8% for the top 5 cities. When you do the same perspective in the United States, you see some familiar cities on this list as well, where the largest 5 cities in terms of emissions contribute about 14.5%, or about 5,000 metric tons. And then finally, if you do the same analysis for Seoul, Seoul is quite an urban, comparatively quite an urban location. So if you look at the 5 largest cities, and we are here we have Daejeon as well, which is kind of the case study city in some of the readings. If you look at the 5 largest cities, they together are responsible for over half of the national emissions in terms of their activities and their consumption. So they have an outsized responsibility within their own country to pursue sustainable energy. So when you're thinking about, okay, why are we discussing cities? Why are we looking at cities? These perspectives that I just shared with you kind of bring home the message that cities have an important role to play, and have an important objective to become more sustainable. So that brings us to the question, how can you think about cities becoming more sustainable? How can a city potentially pursue a different path to change this type of path, this type of profile? So what we identified is that there's a need to think about sustainable energy at a scale that is sufficiently large to really make an impact, right? So you would need to identify ways for, in this case, a city to become more sustainable at a level of scale so that it actually pursues transformative change, right? Where it's not just a business as usual continuation, but an actual pursuit of transformation towards a new energy architecture. And then in terms of research questions, one major criterion is this, that the analysis needs to be sufficiently accurate to convince policymakers, but to also especially convince those who need to finance, who need to pay for the transition plan, right? So some of our research focused on the finance component. And you quite quickly, when you think about a city like Seoul, 10 million people approximately, quite quickly the capital need, the amount of money needed to do a sustainable transition at a level of scale that is transformative, grows to a proportion where you would need to convince investors, right? So you would need to convince, say, banks and investors to put up the capital to pursue such strategies. So that's why an accurate analysis is quite important. And I will kind of illustrate some ways to try and get to an accurate estimate of the opportunity that cities have. So the challenge is that the analysis needs to be sophisticated enough and high accuracy enough and at a level of scale enough that you can develop a plan that is actionable and practical to pursue. So the way we kind of thought about this, and we pride ourselves on pioneering some of these ideas. Naturally, there's other people in the research community that are also thinking about these questions. There's quite a few papers now on the solar city idea. When we started thinking about this idea, we were one of the first, but now it's quite an active field of study. So we came up with these 2 ideas that I will kind of discuss in the rest of the lecture, right? So we have this idea of a solar city where the city becomes quite dependent on pursues the deployment of renewable energy inside of the city at the citywide scale, right? So instead of having individual small projects, you start thinking about solar deployment throughout the city, citywide, at a pace and at a scale that is transformative. So that's kind of the solar city idea. And then you can do kind of the same or similar type of analysis on the energy efficiency side, right? So what we have coined saving city, where you try to reduce the amount of energy consumption inside of the city by a meaningful amount. And then, of course, when you combine the two ideas, you reach an even larger contribution where you could potentially have portions of cities that are entirely or almost self-sufficient, right? They have first brought down their energy consumption level by a meaningful amount, and the remainder they are then able to get from renewable energy. So these two ideas have quite a synergy, and I will kind of briefly go over the solar city, and then I will focus most on the saving city because that's kind of our active field of study at the moment. Like I said, the solar city idea has now been in the research community for, say, roughly about 10 to 15 years, and it's quite an active field of study. Whereas the saving city is relatively new, and is becoming an active field of study. Okay, so when you think about the solar city, it's the consideration of rooftop solar PV in its most strict definition. You could expand it to just renewable energy, or at least maybe not just rooftop solar, but our analysis has always focused on rooftop solar PV opportunities at the city scale. So when you think about this question, the way we have approached it is to rely on this data source that is called LiDAR. It's light detection and ranging, which effectively is a three-dimensional model of the city obtained by flying over the city and shooting a laser down at the city and mapping the entire city in a very high accuracy sense, where the 3D model of the city can see very small features, such as, like, for instance, a chimney on a rooftop is visible for the entire city, right? So you would have the entire city in 3D, and that has been our principal source of information to do this type of analysis. There's other ways to do it. One of the papers that I provided discusses multiple methodologies and kind of comes to the conclusion that relying on something like LiDAR, which is a direct measurement technology where you're actively measuring each and every single rooftop, it will be likely the case that those types of methodologies deliver estimates that are most convincing to, say, an investor or a policymaker. Whereas other sources of methodology where you, for instance, take a small sample and you try to extrapolate to the whole city, those will likely be less convincing to an investor than the direct measurement route. So one of the papers provided kind of tries to make that argument. So once you have the 3D model of the city, you can estimate the rooftop solar PV potential by evaluating the shading. Mostly it's building to building shading, so the amount of shading that a rooftop gets from the building next to it, or the buildings around it. And then the azimuth, which is kind of like the angle of the rooftop. So how many degrees does it go up or down? And then the orientation is which portion of the sky does the rooftop segment face, right? So if it's a north-facing rooftop of a high slope and heavily shaded, then it's not going to be useful for a solar city contribution. But if it's south-facing, so facing the sun, and has very little shading, then it would be, and it's of a small slope, then it would be quite a productive rooftop segment, right? So what you can envision in this type of analysis is that you map the entire city and you computationally calculate for every rooftop what its potential contribution could be, right? So you know its dimensions, and you know the obstructions on the roof, and you can account for things like access need to the roof. And so you can map for the entire city the rooftop real estate that is available for solar PV. So these technologies have been only relatively recently become available because it's quite a heavy computation to execute, right? So for a city like New York City, for instance, it's approximately 1 million buildings. So it's quite a heavy calculation. The LiDAR data set for New York City is about 4 billion data points. Gives you some idea of the work that is involved. So at the foundation, we have become quite uh, capable of doing these kinds of calculations. We've done it for many cities. Um, what we find is that approximately that a large number of the cities that we've looked at can yield roughly 30% of their electricity service needs with citywide rooftop solar PV, right? So if you deploy rooftop solar on every rooftop that is available, that is considered available according to the analysis, then you can support about 30% of your annual electricity service needs, which is, of course, substantial, especially because solar is productive only during the day. So the proportion of electricity service needs that is covered in during the day is more like 2/3 or 70% of the daytime electricity service needs can be covered by rooftop solar if you deploy at the scale as envisioned under the Solar City idea. So what you see in the chart here is a comparison of results for cities of different sizes. So we looked at 10 cities that have more than 1 million people, and you can kind of see a spread um, of results, and they kind of hover around the 30% mark. The size of the circle is the population size of the city, and then we also looked at smaller cities of 400,000 to 1 million, and then from very small cities up to about 400,000, and they can all roughly achieve a 30% contribution from rooftop solar. So this is not just a theoretical idea, right? This is not just research. There are now quite a few cities that have formalized a plan to become a solar city, that have set the goal to become a solar city. So you have, for instance, the city of Seoul, who's initially set a gigawatt of rooftop solar by 2022 and has later changed that perspective to about 800 megawatts by 2030. And then similarly, New York City and London have similar goals where they are pursuing 1 gigawatt by 2030. So the idea, as I said, has been around for some time, and it's been adopted by several cities, and it seems to actually be taking some ground, right? There's some cities that are actually doing it and becoming more or less solar cities over time. So what you see here is that Seoul and New York City are quite rapidly growing their installed capacity. I mapped it out here until 2030. And so you see there's still a reasonably long way to go in terms of their deployment. I only had data up to 2020 for both cities, so obviously they are higher now, but you kind of get a sense of like, oh, if you extrapolate this perspective, they might get quite close to the 1 gigawatt or the 800 megawatt in the case of Seoul objective. So a common way that these cities pursue solar city strategies is that they use their public buildings, they use municipal buildings. They identify parking lots and vacant lands, and they basically deploy solar throughout the city at a fairly large scale. And in addition, they typically incentivize the adoption of solar throughout the city, right? So they make it attractive for residents of the city to install the technology. Seoul is kind of interesting in this regard because it kind of emphasizes the importance of small-scale solar. Even focusing on individual balcony installations. So that's an interesting perspective. Most other cities currently are doing it at a larger scale than balconies, but it does seem to be working in both regards. So that's kind of the solar city, and then the remainder of the talk will be about the saving city. So if you want to think about energy efficiency at the city scale, there's kind of a similar process that would need to be followed. So the way we've approached this is that you rely on databases that have consumption information so that you can identify for individual buildings what is their consumption profile. And South Korea is quite excellent at this. It has a large data set of building level consumption for both electricity and natural gas. So you use that consumption data to build a model for every single building in the city. So similar to the solar city, you effectively build a 3D model of the entire city where you calculate for every individual building what its consumption profile looks like. And if you make changes inside of that building, what its consumption profile would be after those changes. So it requires a modeling strategy that can effectively work well for tens of thousands, in some cases hundreds of thousands of buildings. I mentioned that New York City is about 1 million buildings, so it requires quite a capable model. We are actively looking at saving city potential options in South Korea, and we have mostly focused on Daejeon so far. So I'll briefly kind of go over some of the methodology steps that we've used so that you get an idea of how this kind of analysis is done. So we focused on small residential, large residential, and commercial buildings. So we excluded buildings like military facilities, transportation facilities, education. We kind of focused on buildings that we knew we could model reasonably well in Energy Plus, which is a building simulation software. So we started with about 90,000 buildings. Daejeon has roughly about 140,000 buildings. So this is a sizable portion of the city. But then the consumption data set we had to kind of control for quality. And based on a series of quality controls, we ended up with a sample size of about 30,000 buildings. The quality controls are listed here. It doesn't. The PowerPoint slides will be made available later, and you can kind of go over it if you're interested. But the main thing to know is that it's about 30,000 buildings that we evaluated. So the way we've approached this assessment is to heavily rely on Korean data. Obviously, when you're evaluating a building in a Korean context, it's important to make sure that the data inputs are as much as possible relevant to that building. So we had the Korea Appraisal Board data set for building energy consumption, and then we have weather data that is relevant to Daejeon. We have a data file that describes every single building, its footprint, so its location inside the city and its size. And then we have building code information that describes how energy efficient the building likely already is based on its age. So basically what we did was to build Energy Plus models for every building, for each of the 30,000 or so buildings. And we tried to make that model specific to the building that we were looking at, right? So every model is unique, or each one of the 30,000 buildings models is unique, and as much as possible tailored to the individual building that we're looking at. And then to try to make sure that the building performs in terms of energy consumption, it performs in the same way as the observed building. We had a calibration process where we move within Energy Plus. We move parameters through a calibration so that the energy use intensity matches the observed energy use intensity as much as possible. right? So once you have a calibrated building model, we can then assess the impact of potential retrofit strategies at the city scale. And we looked at two strategies, one for high efficiency lighting, so mostly LED lighting, and high efficiency air conditioning. And then we made sure that our model met this goal of high accuracy, um, where we identified an error rate of less than 3%, which we considered accurate enough to communicate it to the investment community for potential project development. So here you kind of see one of the results. So if you compare the simulated energy use intensity for electricity with the observed energy use intensity for electricity, you can see that our model results for each of the 30,000 buildings fairly closely matches the observed building, right? So on this chart, you see that all the little dots, each dot represents one building, that they are roughly equivalent to the observed data, right? So the mean average percentage error is about 2.9%. So within the 3% marker that we had originally set as a goal. And more than half of the simulations are actually with an even smaller range of error of about 2.5%. So that goes to say that the assessment methodology meets the accuracy goal that we had set for ourselves. So the one thing to be cognizant of in this type of assessment is to make sure that the resulting simulation has a end use balance that kind of that matches what is seen in the Korean literature, what is seen in actual buildings inside of Korea. So we conducted a literature review, and we made sure that the buildings that we looked at, the small residential, large residential, and commercial buildings that we looked at, had an end use balance that was roughly approximate to what the literature suggests is a reasonable balance between the end uses. So you can see here, for instance, that on the small residential side, the left chart of the three charts here, that lighting as an end use takes up about 5% of the electricity need for a small residential building, and that the air conditioning takes up roughly 30 to 35% of the electricity need, which is consistent with the literature. And then similar balances for large residential and commercial, where lights is at about 30% or so, 25 to 30%, which is also consistent with the literature due to those kinds of buildings having the lights on much longer, and having typically less efficient, more lights per unit area than a small residential building. So what we looked at for the Saving City idea was like, okay, if you now have the citywide building model, can we evaluate the contribution of intervention strategies, intervention scenarios? And we looked at, like I said, lighting, where we would upgrade the internal lights of buildings in our model to high efficiency lights. And for the air conditioning, we would upgrade the air conditioning system to best available technology, what we consider best available technology, which is the SEER rating of 18. And what the details of what a SEER rating is not particularly relevant for today, but essentially, the higher the number, the more energy efficient the system. And you can kind of see in these charts, as you move to a more energy efficient system, your consumption goes down by a reasonable amount. Whereas, for instance, if you take lighting from the year 2000 to about 2022, it's about 50% more efficient between those two code levels. So the basic message, I recognize there's quite a lot of information in here, but the basic message is that we've modeled more efficient technology and tried to see what their contribution was. So When you do that for lighting, we identified which buildings could be available for lighting retrofit. And we found that some buildings already had sufficiently efficient lighting, so they were already quite efficient. Those are not available for retrofit, whereas some other buildings were available for retrofit. So out of the 30,371 buildings that we had, 18,321 we considered available for an upgrade for their lighting based on our modeling strategy. And if you apply those interventions across all those buildings, the lighting demand of their electricity consumption could go down by about 80% across the entire building group. And that's, of course, a significant improvement that would be available across the city for lighting, right? So the portion that is that serves lighting could go down by about 80%. Similarly, for air conditioning, we did the same analysis. We identified the buildings that would be available for air conditioning intervention, and we found about 17,083 buildings that we considered available for an air conditioning upgrade. And when we calculated the contribution that would yield, we saw that the air conditioning, the amount of electricity needed for air conditioning would go down by about 52% across that portion of the building stock. Right, so these are significant numbers that are available. So similar to the idea of a solar city being able to generate an amount of electricity at a level that is meaningful to a city, the saving city idea has a meaningful contribution to make if interventions are pursued at a large scale. Obviously, you would not only replace the lights and you would not only replace the air conditioning. You would oftentimes do both, and you would oftentimes do more, right? You would do the windows or the appliances or other equipment inside the building, and you would make that more efficient as well. So there's a significant opportunity for the saving city idea to get as much attention as the solar city idea does. And our research is trying to make the case that the saving city idea has a contribution to make moving forward. This idea is being picked up. The combination of rooftop solar and energy efficiency together obviously has an even larger potential contribution. And what we did is we calculated for Daejeon the rooftop solar potential, which we had done before, and then we calculated the energy savings potential, and we combined the two together. And then what you see is that there are portions of the city that can yield that can cover their electricity services with energy efficiency and renewable energy to a very large, very high degree of their service needs, right? So the dark blue in this case is where more than 90% of their electricity service needs can be covered with energy efficiency and rooftop solar. And then the other blue shades of blue are different levels of percentages. So you see that significant portions of the city would be able to cover a significant amount of their electricity services need. Like I said, this idea is being picked up. Here's this one example, and this is a little bit outdated, but the one less nuclear power plant strategy in Seoul is kind of an example of the saving city idea, where the goal in phase one was to reduce the city's energy demand by an amount equal to the capacity of one nuclear power plant, right? So they recognize their responsibility that I discussed previously with the imbalance between imports and exports of a city, and they pursued a strategy of reducing their electricity use, and their phase one was successful, and they have since then implemented a pursuit of a phase two, and this idea lives on in some capacity, and Seoul has impressive targets for energy efficiency, impressive targets for renewable energy, and kind of is an example of a saving city strategy in some way, right? So that this is just to show that it's hopefully not just a theoretical contribution as to how do you calculate the energy efficiency potential of a city, but that there's also a practical contribution that cities um, are interested in these kinds of ideas. And one way to illustrate their interest is to kind of look at their participation in different initiatives. And there's tens of thousands of cities around the world that are active in initiatives that pursue sustainable energy. And they would be likely at least interested in the idea of solar city and saving city. So this is the to close kind of the idea that these research strategies hopefully will find a practical application in cities around the world. So that's the presentation. I appreciate your time, and I hope this was useful. And I look forward to the round of questions, and I hope I can be useful answering those.
Thank you very much, Dr. Terminal. Do you hear me okay now?
I hear you fine. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, Dr. Terminal, for sharing your knowledge and expertise, especially those in the context of South Korea. And I'm sure it was both inspiring and highly relevant to the class. So now we'll move on to Q&A session. So if any of the students have any question based on today's lecture, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions. Okay, if you need a little time, I have some list of previously collected questions. So first of all, I will select a few out of them. So first one seems like a policy-wise question, and it asks, what strategies can cities in East Asia, including Korea, employ to transform their urban energy metabolism effectively, considering their technological innovations, policy frameworks, and social equity? It's asking about the strategies.
Yeah. So I mean, so the ideas of Solar City and Saving City are strategies to pursue. The kind of like the practical way of pursuing a solar city is to initially start with building a incentive structure for your citizens to adopt renewable energy, and at the same time to build like a deployment strategy on your own municipal and public buildings, right? So your schools, your city halls, and things like that would be initial targets. Parking lots, those would be initial targets for renewable energy. That has been kind of the way that cities pursue these ideas. And then on the energy efficiency side, the way Dr. Byrne will talk about this in much more detail, but one way to consider this is to know as a city that you are using quite a large amount of electricity. So, for instance, Seoul Metropolitan Government has quite a large number of buildings for its public use. Those could be combined together as one large project to facilitate energy efficiency intervention, right? So the analysis results I was showing are for like tens of thousands of buildings at once. Those buildings can be prioritized and ranked based on their contribution, and a city could say take the first 200, the 200 most energy wasteful buildings that could be where the most money could be saved with an energy efficiency strategy and start there, right? So that would be one kind of practical way of pursuing this strategy.
you. So if anyone has any other questions, if not, we'll go on to from the bunch of questions. There were also some questions on technical side and their applications and challenges. So you discussed utilizing LiDAR to estimate PV potential. So could you elaborate on the following points? I have 2 points here. First one is, what technological hurdles might arise during the rooftop PV system implementation? And the following one is, what technological advancements could help overcome these kind of challenges?
Yeah. So there's practical challenges on the research side, and there's practical challenges on actually installing solar on tens of thousands of rooftops, right? So on the research side, practical challenges are that data availability is still quite limited, right? So one of the papers I provided kind of argues that LiDAR is the best available way of doing this type of analysis. It's just that LiDAR data is not always available. It's still fairly new, relatively new for this purpose, and it needs to be of high enough quality. So that's one practical hurdle on the research side, that you simply might not have the data to do the analysis, and then you would have to rely on an analysis strategy that, for instance, takes a sample and extrapolates to the whole city, and that might be harder to communicate to the city itself to actually do the strategy. Another challenge on the research side is that when you're evaluating these data sets at this scale, it becomes quite computationally difficult. So it simply requires a level of knowledge of working with higher performance computers that is not necessarily available to everyone. On the practical side of actually deploying rooftop solar on tens of thousands of buildings, there's some obvious ones, right? So it's like you have a physical infrastructure that you need to put in place, and that requires that you go on top of buildings with equipment and with solar panels and install on large numbers of buildings. It requires a lot of people to do. So there's a practical timeline challenge that it will simply take time to do, right? Like, it's not something that you can do in 1 year and declare victory. It's a practical physical process to do. And then the other main challenge is that it requires a lot of capital, right? So if you want to do this at a large scale, rooftop solar is still upfront. The upfront capital cost is still relatively high. Rooftop solar is dramatically cheaper than it was 10 years ago, but because you are purchasing, and often you're purchasing the equipment, the technology upfront, a lot of the costs associated with the strategy are in the early stages of the project, and a lot of the benefits are throughout the entire project. So you would have to kind of balance those in a smart way. And then you have to have access to capital. You have to be able to borrow money at a large scale to pursue the strategy. So that's why you're seeing cities like New York, London, and Seoul doing this kind of strategy. Those are comparatively wealthy cities, comparatively sophisticated cities that have institutional capability to actually, let's say, borrow on the capital market for a large amount of money, that have the personnel to draft these strategies, right? So they are the largest cities that are able to do this at a large scale. So those are some practical difficulties with the ideas.
And this one is from my personal curiosity. So do Three Foundation collaborate with city officials or government organizations? Because it seems like you need a detailed and large big data that would be essential for the citywide estimation.
Yeah. So we do interact with quite a large number of different cities at different levels. We were very closely involved with Seoul Metropolitan Government for since about 2014 to about 2020, roughly, right before COVID, right before the Corona pandemic. So we do interact with cities, and then we work together a lot with research institutes. So, for instance, the Daejeon research that we have conducted was done in collaboration with the Korea Institute of Energy Research, KIER. And those kinds of partnerships are quite beneficial to do the research that we're setting out to do, right? To get the data, to get the insight into the priorities of what the city is looking for. And it also helps quite a lot in trying to actually convince the city to pursue the strategy, right? So we were involved as one of many. We were involved in the Seoul Solar City initiative to try and get Seoul to pursue a solar city strategy.
Thank you. Does anyone have questions from the class? Live questions? No. Then I'll go back to the list of questions that I select. Oh, there is a question from the chat in the chat room. Could you check? Oh, there's a
Yes. Unique challenge.
You want me to read it? Yeah, maybe you can read it and yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's an excellent question. I appreciate very much the question. So the idea of a shared rooftop, right? So that is quite common. So one reason of thinking about balconies is that the balcony is not shared, but the rooftop would be shared. So one way to think about rooftop solar in those cases, or energy efficiency in those cases, is to treat the multifamily building or the collection of multifamily buildings in the case of a series of apartment buildings as one unit, right? So you would pool together their consumption, and you would pool together their rooftop space. That is kind of like the idea behind community solar, where the individual people inside the apartment building contribute as a participant. They get the benefits as a participant to a larger project than themselves. And they effectively are like a component of the larger project. So that is quite a common strategy to pursue. So community solar is a strategy where you would put solar on the rooftop, and then you would distribute the benefits to the residents of the building, say to the multifamily building equally. So that's one of the challenges of shared rooftop ownership, and that's one way to try and overcome them. I hope that's sufficient to that question. So there's an additional one here. The centralized power generation system creates further barriers to the integration and expansion of distributed energy. So there's an inherent tension between a centralized system and a transition to a decentralized system. Right? It's going to be a process that is not necessarily smooth, right? So if you have a centralized system that is operated by a centralized authority, typically the centralized authority is not motivated to support the decentralization of the energy infrastructure. So what you see is that it takes important, powerful actors, like, for instance, Seoul Metropolitan Government, right? Like Seoul, as a city of 10 million people, has power, has an ability to set out strategies that might contradict the previous direction of the energy system. It's harder to do as a smaller city or town, still possible, I would argue. But there is a tension there that my knowledge of the Korean utility system is is more limited than my knowledge of the U.S. utility system. So in the U.S. Case, what you see is that quite a large number of utility companies fight the installation of decentralized energy generation facilities, right? They are oftentimes not in favor, and they oftentimes lobby against it. And it takes effort, and it takes a struggle to make sure that the policy remains favorable, that the people in favor of it have a more important say in the conversation than the utility against it. The policy environment in the United States is trending towards ever more favorable conditions. So it appears, I think that the transition in the United States, at least, is still ongoing, but it will complete itself over time. It is at a stage, and it's operating at a speed that the centralized system will not be able to stop necessarily. So what that means is that the utility companies will have to adapt and change. Oftentimes, the argument is that they become like a wires only company where they manage the flow of electricity, but they get out of the generation and out of the procurement space. So they no longer procure electricity, they no longer generate electricity. They just manage the flow of electricity, for which you still need a centralized grid, right? You still need a connection system. And that appears to me that is the role of the utility company moving forward over time, at least in the United States. Okay, so that I can just answer this last one here as well. So policy approaches, international examples that could help South Korea address ownership and structural constraints. Yeah, so it's a great question. I think I'll leave this one for Dr. Byrne. Dr. Byrne will talk explicitly about kind of this question, the tension between ownership and the structural incentives inside of the system. So I would recommend to ask that question to Dr. Byrne after you listen to his presentation, because it's going to discuss that specifically. So
thank you, Dr. Tarinel. So any other questions? So I think this should be maybe the final questions. Extending from the question from Hyung-Ju Chang, he was asking about the individual level, maybe the building level, whether it's what if it's an apartment that different multifamily housing, and at the systems level. And there was a question on the city level. So your research focuses on Daejeon, right? And we have a very densely populated metropolitan Seoul. So there are different contexts, maybe different contexts. So what would be the challenges, or maybe a kind of a different aspect that we need to take into consideration to the cities like Seoul, densely populated cities like Seoul, face in achieving energy self-sufficiency, especially compared to like less densely populated cities like Daejeon?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. In a general sense, I would argue that even if cities are quite different, they share more in common than they have differences. Like life lived in one city to the next might look quite different, but fundamentally it has a lot of things in common. So the application of these kinds of ideas across city contexts, I think, is quite possible, right? So there are, like I was saying, there are differences in terms of the amount of power a city has, political power, institutional power, capital. Those things are all different, but in terms of energy consumption, And in terms of why energy is consumed and how it is consumed, there's quite a significant overlap between a city like Seoul and a city like Daejeon. So the type of analysis that I discussed today would be quite applicable to a city like Seoul. The way the city would be able to capitalize on the research findings would be different, right? Like a city like Seoul can um, implement a strategy at a very different way than a city like Daejeon can. The density component is obviously difficult for rooftop solar. The more people that live under one roof, the smaller the contribution of that particular roof to the energy consumption profile. But one thing I think that people oftentimes overlook is that if you look at a city from on top as like a bird's eye view, the amount of space that is actually available is still enormously significant, right? Like the rooftop real estate, if you want to call it that, is very, very large, even for a city like Seoul that is quite vertical and that's quite densely populated. We looked at cities like Seoul, New York, Tokyo. Those are all vertical, high density cities. And oftentimes they still can reach, at a technical level, they could still reach a rooftop solar contribution that is 30% or so of their annual electricity needs. So I think while this is a very relevant question, I think it deserves a lot of attention. I think oftentimes it gets like the idea gets dismissed more easily than it should, based on the argument of density. I think the argument of density is not a barrier to the idea to the extent that people sometimes think. Like we've looked at highly dense, highly vertical cities, and they still have an enormous amount of rooftop space available.
Thank you. That was clarifying the questions. And if there are no more questions, I think we can wrap up for today. And again, thank you very much, Dr. Tamanao, for sharing your insights and expertise with us today, especially for the very detailed explanations of real-life examples. And thank you for the students for your active participation and thoughtful questions that you had submitted previously. So I think we can wrap up for this class.
I just want to mention real quick, I did have my email address in this slide. So if you have any questions that you feel did not get addressed, please feel free to email me and I'll try to get to them.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. Take care.
Yeah. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.